Hello, Leafs fans, and welcome to the Babbling Buds Podcast, hosted by Jordan Jacklin.
Welcome to the 9th episode of the Babbling Buds Podcast, hosted by yours truly, Jordan Jacklin. A once-a-week show covering the Toronto Maple Leafs and the NHL as a whole, bringing in a mix of various analytics and the eye test when discussing players and the team. I thank you for joining me today, and to make sure you don't miss out on any future episodes, follow us on Twitter at the Babbling Buds to stay up to date on all news surrounding the show. And it's a pleasure to announce today's guest. He's returning. It's Alex Hobson, a Toronto Maple Leafs and prospects contributor for the Hockey Writers. His Twitter is at HobsonA16, and it's time to just dive right into our Leafs offseason talk. How are you doing tonight, Alex?
Doing great, Jordan. Again, thanks a lot for having me on the show. Looking forward to chatting about the world's most universally loved and hated hockey team.
Oh, very much so. And I mean, we're already hearing a lot of speculation because first up, Pierre LeBrun on Insider Trading talked about how there's still a chance Freddie Andersen stays in Toronto. So Anderson's agent spoke with management, and the question they got was, is Andersen interested in potentially resigning and staying put? And the answer that they got was yes. So I'm just curious, Alex, let's just start this off. What is a reasonable contract to re-sign him at? Cap hit, term, what are you thinking?
Well, that's a really, really tough question in my opinion, because if last season taught us anything, it showed us that Jack Campbell, as it stands right now, has taken the crease from Freddie Andersen. And I have no doubt that the Freddie Andersen that we saw last year is not the Freddie Andersen that we're going to see every year. I think he's had a couple of rough seasons in a row, but we've all seen what he's capable of when he's at the top of his game. And I have faith that he can get back to that point. But the problem that I have with bringing back Freddie Andersen, first of all, actually, I should probably answer your question. If I were to plan out a contract for Freddie, I think the only condition that you would have to put down for fans not to go after Kyle Dubas's head, he would have to sign for less than what he was making on his last contract.
Oh, that's a given. It'd have to be the pay cut.
100%. And so if I were to bring him back, I wouldn't go any higher than $3 million a year. I would probably say that's probably the max that I would do. And the reason I say that is because the Leafs have $10 million in cap space to work with right now. And on top of having to deal with Freddie Andersen's potential want to return, they've also got to worry about potentially finding a replacement for Zach Hyman, because there's increasing speculation, and again, all speculation, nothing confirmed yet, but based on the kind of what's going on around the media and what's going on around the hockey mecca of the world, it sounds like Zach Hyman is looking more like he's going to test the open market rather than re-sign with the Leafs. And if he leaves, that's a big blow for Toronto. So they've got to also worry about replacing him because he's a top 6 winger. And on top of that, if Jack Campbell can prove that he can be a good starting goalie next year, you could get a competent backup goalie, someone along the lines of a Chris Drieger or even like a Darcy Kemper, someone like that, to fill in the backup goalie position, or at least play a 1B role. And you could probably get them at a much cheaper price than you could get Andersen. So I know that obviously Freddie Andersen is well liked among his teammates, and I'm sure that the Leafs would love to see him back, but I don't know what the price would be. Because like I said, you've got multiple areas to worry about this offseason, and I think there's truthfully a bigger needs than addressing that 1B slot in the crease.
No, I definitely agree with you there. And I mean, when talking about Freddie, we're talking about NHL GMs here, right? Like, I have a hard time believing somebody isn't going to pay him on reputation at a $5 million rate or even more. Like, look at what Sergei Bobrovsky's making. And, it's arguable that Andersen, at least as of now, is still even better than what Bobrovsky's providing for the Florida Panthers. And I think it's reasonable to expect somebody will pay him starting money and play him as a starter. Now, he's heading towards the thing about goalies is it's interesting because some of them do play better as they get older. It's tough to know what Freddie's going to be like in the next 5 years, if he'll continue to maybe even improve somewhat, or if he's just going to go completely down the drain. That's kind of the risk you would be taking in this position. But there's a lot of options here for the Leafs, and this kind of leads into my last question on the topic. Should the Leafs look elsewhere, whether it's via free agency or trade? And basically, has the Andersen era in Toronto passed its course?
again, that's a tough question. That's a good question, and it's a tough one to answer because, like I said, it all comes down to what Freddie Anderson will demand and how much Kyle Dubas is willing to spend on him and how long he's willing to sign him for. Because I think the other variable that we got to take into consideration here is what if Jack Campbell comes out next season and he plays just as good as he played down the stretch in 2020, 2021. And all of a sudden his contract is up too, and you got to look at bringing him back. So, I mean, obviously having two great goalies is a great problem to have. I don't think anybody's denying that, but it just, again, for me, it all comes down to how much Dubas is willing to spend on his second goalie and how much he's willing to commit to addressing other areas. It's really hard to say. If there is a situation out there where Freddie Anderson would want to return on like a 1-year contract at $2 million a year, I know that's a very, very far cry, but if Freddie Anderson showed that he really, truly just wanted to be in Toronto and he wanted to be back with his teammates again, he wanted a better shot to prove to teams that he can be the Freddie Anderson that he was in 2017 and 2018, then I could see them bringing him back. But like you said, it's hard to believe that there's not other teams out there that would give him upwards of $5 million a year because of what he's done. And we've seen that come into play in free agency. We've seen that in years past. So if there's a team that's kind of on the cusp of contending and they've got the cap space to work with and they need a good starting goalie, I can't think of a team off the top of my head. But if there's a team like that, who knows? That might be a little more of an appealing offer for Freddie, especially if he can guarantee himself upwards of 50 starts a season. So.
Well, yeah, there's an argument to be made like that he could potentially sign a 1-year deal at a lower cap hit to maybe try to provide himself an opportunity to make a lot more in the open market next year. But even looking at players that have done that in years past, like a Taylor Hall or Kevin LeBanc, that hasn't exactly worked out for them. Like there's no way Taylor Hall's making more than $8 million on the open market. No. Kevin LeBanc ended up screwing himself by not taking whatever longer term deal maybe he could have gotten offered there. That generally doesn't seem to really work that well for the player. And I have to imagine Anderson would probably wants a little bit more security, but it's at least nice to know that there is a potential for him to come back. Cause I mean, it does kind of suck, that it's kind of ended off like this. Like
totally.
He was the backbone of this team, of this next generation of players. And there were troubles during the playoffs, but I just wish it could have ended off better. Maybe there's another chapter to the story.
I agree. I mean, I started watching hockey in 2005, and Freddie Anderson was the first actual good goalie I got the opportunity to witness in Toronto. And when I say an actual good goalie, I mean a guy that you can turn to for 60 games out of the year to maybe not a Vezina contender, but a guy that can give you 60 good games and he can be reliable down the stretch as well. I mean, he's the first option I've seen. I mean, the first goalie I ever watched was Andrew Raycroft, and we all know how that ended up. So yeah, I'm a big Freddie Anderson fan. I know I hate rooting against. I don't root against him. I hate that we're having this conversation because in a perfect world, he'd be the same Freddie Anderson as he was 4 years ago. But yeah, it's going to be a tough decision to make. And regardless of what happens, I wish nothing but the best for him.
Definitely. And we have to move on here because Nick Richard of the Leafs Nation on Twitter pointed out how it'd be really cool if the Leafs could get one of those surprise third line contributors out of a guy like Joey Anderson or Philip Hollander. And I've been told that, he said, I've been told stuff happens for teams sometimes. I guess he's kind of specifically pointing at the Tampa Bay Lightning, obviously, just have an abundance of those type of players. So I have to pose the question for you, Alex. Do you think either one of Anderson or Hollander could be that guy for the Leafs next season? Or maybe even someone else, if you can pull it out of your hat?
I think Joey Anderson probably has the best odds between him and Philip Hollander of a guy that can be a surprise contributor on the third line, just because I remember when Kyle Dubas traded Andreas Janssen for him back before last season started. I remember Dubas said something along the lines of he brought Anderson in because he feels he can be a contributor on the team. And it's not like they just traded for him to waste him away in the AHL. It's they brought him in because they thought that he could be a valuable depth piece. And obviously he didn't get too much ice time in the NHL this year. But from what I've seen of Joey Anderson, he plays sort of a similar game to Zach Hyman. He's a bit of a pest. He likes to go into the dirty areas. He likes to create space. He likes to create a ruckus out on the ice. And if Hyman does end up leaving, in fact, then all of a sudden you have a need to bring in a player who can kind of provide that kind of game. And I'm not entirely sure if Joey Anderson will end up being a full-time Leaf next year, but I do think he'll probably get some more looks than he did last year.
I do remember when Anderson actually came in that trade that he said he models his game after Zach Hyman. Actually, now maybe he's just appealing to Leafs fans making that comment, but I mean, it would be awesome to see a guy like that kind of excel in that role and maybe be a surprise fourth line contributor, because a guy like Joe Thornton probably isn't coming back next year, and you need to have kind of some younger guys step into those roles and succeed. And in terms of other guys, I really don't know. Like, I think we're going to get to see more of Adam Brooks next year. Hopefully, maybe he can win the spot. We'll never know if a guy like Nick Batan could make it. I wonder what Dennis Malkin is going to be like next year, because he's a sneaky. I think he could honestly be a full-time NHL player eventually in his career.
I was going to say Dennis Malkin is a very interesting name that you just brought up now. And I to be completely honest, I forgot that he was even under contract with the Leafs until like April.
I think a lot of people have.
Yeah, because the obviously the NHL season was in jeopardy, and he went back over to Switzerland to play in his hometown. Did well there, if I'm recalling correctly. But yeah, he was I don't know if he was ever a full-time NHLer for Florida, but I know that he was at least getting into a good amount of games, and he's proven that he can be an NHL player. Like, he can be a guy that you can get away with icing on your third or fourth line. So that's a good point. I completely forgot about him. And yeah, it's I think he could be a contributor as well. I'm not sure where he'll be next year, if the Leafs plan to use him with the Marlies or whatever the move happens to be. I do think that guys like Philip Hollander and potentially even Rodion Amirov, I don't know what their plans for him are yet, but I do think we're going to see a little bit more of an influx of youth on the Marlies this year. This year was a little bit of a dead year for the Marlies. They didn't have too many prospects playing for them aside from Nick Robertson and Joey Anderson, if you want to call him that, Adam Brooks. But I do think we're going to see a little bit of an influx in exciting prospects playing for the Marlies this year. And guys like Hollander and Amirov, I think both of them are going to get at least one full year in the AHL before they bring him up, before the Leafs bring him up to the NHL. But I think both of them in particular are, I think they're both contenders to be full-time Leafs at some point.
Yeah, I agree with you there. And I just kind of got to ask this, talking about surprises. When was the last time you can recall the Leafs getting one of these players that kind of surprised? The guys I could think of off the top of my head were Ilya Mikheyev, I would say, just because there weren't necessarily expectations for him coming in. And I mean, the fact that he played a 50-point pace in his rookie season was great. I know he's been a lot more scrutinized as a player just because of his lack of scoring this past season, but people kind of forget that he was a player that was brought in here for free and, had no expectations like that. I mean, we would have been happy had he just been like a fourth line grinder, and he's now been able to be at least a third line contributor. And I would say probably before him would be Andreas Janssen, being a 7th round pick. Yeah. And his story is quite interesting. I mean, the media didn't even pronounce his name right for the first few years. They kept calling him Andreas Johnson. I remember that. Yeah. And then he finally just corrected it one day.
I know. I love that too, because that's totally the type of thing that I would do as well. I'd be too nice to tell the media, hey, you're pronouncing my name wrong. Like, this is how you say it. I'd just be like, yeah, call me whatever you want.
The Leafs don't really have too many of those guys, eh? Like, I don't know if you have anybody else to name.
No, I mean, the other name that I would have come up with off the top of my head there was Adam Brooks, but it's kind of hard to give him that title because he didn't really get into too many games. I mean, obviously he became more of a regular player towards the end of the season, and he did get into a playoff game or two, if I recall correctly, but he didn't really, I guess, kind of come up and lock down a roster spot like most of these other guys did, right? So I feel like you could throw Adam Brooks onto that list if he were to be called up and become a regular third line player for the Leafs. I think there's definitely potential there because he had 4 points in his first 6 games this year. He scored in his first NHL game. I think there's some untapped potential there for him to be a very solid third line player. It's just a matter of if he can squeeze out that spot and keep it.
Yeah, we'll see if Adam Brooks this year makes it 3 years in a row he scores in his first game, because he just has a knack for doing that. But Michael, also known as @TheLeafsIMO on Twitter, made a tweet today on how Nick Robertson needs to be an NHL regular next season, and the Leafs would be better off for it. I got to ask, Alex, do you think his time in the AHL should be done?
That's a really tough question as well, because Nick Robertson also hasn't really had a full AHL season under his belt.
Yeah, no.
Because if you recall to 2019-20, he spent that season with Peterborough of the OHL. And then when the Leafs came back into the bubble to play Columbus, he was named to the roster. He scored a goal. It was great. But then even this year, I think the plan this year was for him to get some I think he started the season with the Leafs, but then the plan was for him to get a full AHL season under his belt, but he ended up being injured for most of it.
You think so? I think they were really hoping that he was going to be able to stay healthy and play a full year at the Leafs. I think they really wanted him to take the step this year and thought he could, but it just didn't work out that way for him.
Yeah, I mean, the injuries definitely, they definitely screwed with him a little bit, and I guess kind of threw him off track of where he was supposed to be in his developments. The thing with Nick Robertson is because he's more of a pure goal scorer than some other prospects are, if you're going to keep him in the NHL all year, it kind of has to be in a top 6 role, or at the very least a third line role where he's not being played with boat anchors and he's playing with guys who can actually set him up. I would probably, and again, this will all depend on who the Leafs bring in this offseason, because I feel like there's still a lot of options open. Who knows? Because Kyle Dubas could, for all we know, he could be conservative with his free agent signings and kind of leave a bunch of roster spots open for Marlies guys to claim, or he could do what he normally does and go out and sign a bunch of players to 1-year league minimum contracts just to kind of get them to prove what they can do. So it's a tough call, because I think it all comes down to what Dubas does this offseason. But I think that they'll probably try and squeeze out as much of a full AHL season for Robertson before they bring him up to the NHL. And then I guess at that point, once he's played a full AHL season and he's been consistent for an entire year in the AHL, I think at that point they'll bring him up and they'll have him ready for a top 6 role. And at that point, I think he'd be ready to go off. But having said that, if he were to come out and make the roster out of training camp and be in a top 6 role or even a top 9 role all year, I would be okay with that. I think he's at a point now where he can be a capable NHL player, but I think it's just a matter of whether you want him to be capable or you want him to be a good NHL player.
Yeah, definitely. And I also got to ask, because I think he can be a capable player, but I want to know what he's capable of in the future. And do you see him having that same ceiling as his brother Jason, who finished 2nd in Calder voting this past season with Dallas? Do you think he can be that type of player that Jason was with the Dallas Stars?
I think he can. Yeah, I truthfully think that the Leafs, I mean, assuming all the development goes correctly and these guys develop at the pace the Leafs expect them to and end up with the ceilings that the Leafs hope they end up with, I think we could see a really electric top 2 left wings of Amarov and Robertson in the future. I think those are, as it stands right now, both of them are their top left wing prospects. So if you bring those 2 guys in, Amarov's got a bit of a 2-way game to him. Robertson's a pure goal scorer. I think having those 2 on the top 2 lines, it could be almost like a Kane and Hossa kind of thing. I mean, it might be a bit of a stretch comparing those 2 to those guys, but I do think Robertson has some serious potential. I think because he was so young, the pace that he was scoring at his age, if I recall correctly, I'm pretty sure he just missed the cutoff date by a couple days. So he was one of the youngest players in the draft, if not the youngest.
He was,
and
yes.
I think had he gone the year after, I think he would have been a 1st-round pick, 100%.
He probably would have been top 10 if he had that exact same year. If he had that like 55 goal season, he would have been a top 10 pick. In my eyes, at
100%
least.
He would have. Yeah, and it's just. Yeah, I think there's a lot of untapped potential there. I think it's a little too early to call him a steal just because he hasn't really played in the NHL yet. But I think that pick definitely has serious potential to end up being a home run.
Yeah, because honestly, if both Amarov and Robertson proved to be the players that people believe they can be during their ELC, that's going to be major for the Leafs, because that's going to be like a 2-year window where they could really go for it and kind of surround themselves with maybe more 3rd and 4th line depth. Because after that, then say one of these guys surprises really hard, then you're going to have serious roster questions right in your big 4, I would assume. But we're probably jumping a little bit too ahead 100%. Of ourselves. Let's just hope these guys make it to the NHL first. But, it's at least we can have this conversation with these guys. At least they're in our organization. So there's at least some positive lights here for Leafs fans just by us having this conversation. Mm-hmm. With that, let's head into our
at the end of the tunnel.
There is. Let's head into our general NHL news here. And these teams have some light in the end of the tunnel, specifically the Tampa Bay Lightning. We're talking Stanley Cup Finals. And, it has been kind of a boring one as the series progressed. It's had its moments of brilliance, but Tampa is winning their series 3-0 against the Montreal Canadiens. And unless a miracle happens, they are poised to win a game 4 or 5. we got to talk about some of the storylines of this series. Carey Price is starting game 4, which should be expected, even though there are people who believe Jake Allen should get the nod. What's interesting is Price has an .835 save percentage in the finals, which is the worst since Gary Cheever's .822 save percentage in 1977 with a minimum of 3 games played. Do you think Price should be the guy playing in game 4? Do you think he's earned that benefit of the doubt?
I will put it to you this way. The backlash, if the Habs were to start Carey Price in game 4 and lose, would be absolutely nothing compared to the backlash that Dominique Ducharme and Marc Bergevin would face if the Habs were to start Jake Allen in game 4 and lose. Because obviously Price has had a tough series, but look at what he's done in the playoffs before that. Look what he did against Toronto, what he did against Winnipeg, and what he did against Vegas. Look at what he's done since he's been in the NHL. We all know what playoff Carey Price is capable of. And the reality is, at any point, he is capable of channeling that inner version of him. He's capable of becoming that playoff Carey Price. And while I guess there is an argument to be made that if Price is struggling, you could try your backup out. Jake Allen, to his credit, he's been reliable. He's been a good backup for the Habs. I think he's been probably better than they expected. But when you're down 3-0 in the series and you have 1 game left to keep your Stanley Cup hopes alive, I don't think there's any other option. You have to go to Carey Price in that game just because of what he's capable of, what he's done in the past, and what he's done for that organization.
Yeah, definitely. I think at the least we're in this position, you wouldn't be saying, the Leafs should start David Rittich in a series elimination game. You would,
no, exactly.
You would start Jack Campbell, and like Montreal, this is a very much higher stakes version of that. You start playoff Price because he's earned that title, and even if they do end up losing here, which it does kind of seem likely, they'll go out fighting. But there is some hope here because Dominique Ducharme's actually been in this position before as a head coach, having come back from a 3-0 series deficit with the Halifax Mooseheads to beat the Quebec Ramparts in the QMJHL quarterfinals in 2012. Do you think there's some hope left for Montreal in this series? Do you think there is any way in doubt they could somehow beat Tampa 4 straight times?
Well, I think the odds are probably about as slim as you can get, but I will never, ever have the confidence to say that the Habs are 100% guaranteed to lose. And honestly, it just comes back to the fact that nobody expected the Habs to beat the Leafs, let alone come back from 3-1 to beat them. Even all the Sportsnet analysts you remember when they released that list of every single Sportsnet reporter, analyst, host who listed their prediction? Even Eric Engels, who covers the Habs for Sportsnet, said Leafs in 7. Obviously, he probably wasn't thinking about the Leafs track record in game 7s when he made that pick. But but yeah, my point is nobody expected the Habs to beat the Leafs. Maybe a couple people expected them to put up a fight against Winnipeg, but ultimately I think people probably expected Winnipeg to win that series. And when they played Vegas, no one expected the Habs to beat Vegas. The team that just knocked out Colorado, who most people were calling for the Stanley Cup in round 2 or before. I mean, probably just coming into round 2, people had serious hopes for the Colorado Avalanche to win the Stanley Cup, and Vegas had their way with them. So nobody, I think, could have expected Montreal to beat Vegas. So because of all this, I'm not counting anything out. I actually tweeted something like this the other day. No one expected the Habs to win in any of those other series. So I'm not going to stop counting them out now. We've seen that this team displays a level of resilience. We've seen what playoff Price is capable of. We've seen what Cole Caulfield and Nick Suzuki are capable of. I still think Tampa Bay is going to win this series. I think Tampa Bay is just too good to give up four losses in a row to the Habs, but I'm not counting it out because the Habs have shocked a lot of people this year, and I don't see why they'd stop now.
There's 2 possibilities in my mind at this moment. I think Montreal's either getting swept tomorrow night, or I think they're going to make it to game 7. They're going to force it, and they're going to somehow lose in game 7, in my opinion. I think it's going to be one of those 2 things. I think it's going to be extremely one way or extremely the other. I don't think they're going to lose in game 5 or 6 would be my take. Maybe they do win it.
That's kind of like the that's kind of the same take that I had for the Leafs heading into these playoffs. I said they're either going to win the Stanley Cup or they're going to choke round one.
Yeah, that's what I thought too, honestly, because I thought if they won that series, there would have been a lot of momentum, man. Because I think people don't really, they're not considering the fact if they get this monkey off their back, they're going to be a completely different team. Like these questions that surround them in first round playoff series will not be questions in rounds 2 and above that. And hopefully one day, hopefully that day could come soon enough. If not next year, which it better be.
Yeah, I've been waiting for 16 years at this point. And I know that doesn't even hold a candle to what some fans have been waiting for, but I mean, that's my whole career as a hockey fan. So there's that.
It definitely is. But even we still got to talk a little bit Montreal here, because is Josh Anderson's lack of production extremely worrisome heading not only into these potential last few games of the Stanley Cup Finals, but in the future? Because remember, he has 6 years left at that $5.5 million cap hit. What have you thought of his play so far?
You know, I said this as soon as Josh Anderson signed that extension, or I guess you could call it an extension. As soon as he signed that contract with Montreal, I said that is David Clarkson 2.0 right there. And, you know, it's not even an anti-Habs thing, because I've seen what Josh Anderson's capable of doing. We've seen him do it to the Leafs. We've seen him do it to other teams. When he's on the top of his game, he is a super speedy power forward who has a knack for scoring goals. And I don't see how 31 other GMs aren't drooling over the thought of having that on their team. But I think his lack of production in these playoffs and just the lack of production from him recently, when you go back to last year as well, he only had like 4 points last year in 31 games or something like that. So yes, I do think it is a concern. I mean, I think anytime your $5.5 million player who's on for another 6 or 7 years isn't performing, I think anytime that happens, that's a concern. That creates a cause for concern. So if I were a Habs fan, or if I were Habs management rather, I would be concerned, but at the same time, I'd also give him a chance to rebound next year, because it's not really like the whole David Clarkson contract in the sense where the Leafs kind of knew like 30 games into the season that he was washed.
He was just bad immediately. At least Josh Anderson, I mean, he showed that he's capable of at least being somewhat decent. He just can't be. He hasn't been consistent over the long term with them at this moment.
No, and that's why I'm saying I think the Habs are going to obviously give Anderson a couple years to rebound and show that he can be that 30 goal, 50 point guy for them. But maybe not 50 point, but 20, 30 goal, 40, 50 point in that ballpark anyways, because his physicality and his speed kind of round out the rest of the value on the contract. But yeah, it's anytime you're, like I said, anytime your multi-million-dollar player, multi-year player isn't producing, I think it creates a cause for concern, especially in the playoffs when the stakes are higher than they've ever been.
Well, I think the best thing you could say here is that he's already kind of looked at his worst. He's taken himself out of position, trying to do too much physically in these first few games. I don't think you're going to necessarily see him be as bad in game 4 and potentially moving on this series. I think at some point he'll regress to the mean and you'll finally see some production. I mean, he scored a 2-goal game in these playoffs. Maybe people forget about that against, it was Vegas, I believe he did that against. And you have to think at some point he is going to eventually get back into it. But the Habs do have some questions here in terms of their lineup. And I just want to know what changes you would make to their lineup heading into game 4. I think an easy one for me, I know he hasn't necessarily played that much, but this is a good player. They're just sitting out, and that's Tomas Tatar. I would be putting this player back into the lineup. You can insert him for whoever you want. I would personally be doing that because I don't know. He's just too good of a player in my eyes. I want to know what you would do.
Truth be told, I as soon as you asked me that question, that was the first thing that popped into my mind, and nothing else has really come to mind. I know that's a little bit of a boring answer, but yeah, Tomas Tatar, I mean, you can say whatever you want about him not being a playoff producer, but with a fully healthy roster, he is arguably one of their best forwards. And sure, he's not producing. Sure, there are other guys that maybe deserve to be in there over him, but when the Stanley Cup is on the line, I think you just got to roll that dice and you got to give him a shot and kind of give him a chance to be like, hey, listen, Tomas, this is your chance to prove us wrong and show us that you can be a valuable playoff contributor. And there's no better time than right now because we're hanging by a thread. So yeah, if I were Ducharme, that's probably the only move that I would make. I think you got to get him into the lineup.
Yeah, I think so too, because I get it. He's going to be an unrestricted free agent this offseason. who knows? I mean, at this point, looking at the playoffs, I wonder if they even bring him back. I think he's going to be such a buy low candidate. He's going to be a steal this offseason because he's a really good player if he's given the right opportunity and deployed correctly. I wouldn't even mind the Leafs signing him if there was really an opportunity to be made there.
No.
But I would love to have him on the team playing next to Tavares and Nylander.
Yeah, I could see him being that $1.5 million 1-year steal that Kyle Dubas seems to
God,
get every
please.
season.
That'd be ridiculous. But I don't know.
It would.
I just hope so. I mean, the Habs have a lot of question marks. We'll see if they can get some answers tomorrow night as they try to shave off elimination. We got to talk about the Edmonton Oilers and how they are, in fact, the front runners to land Duncan Keith in a potential trade. And that just kind of screams bad decision in my eyes. Maybe not if they get creative and can work out maybe even a 3-team trade to reduce his salary to below a $2 million cap hit. And then maybe you don't pay that much. He's a third pairing guy. You kind of know what you're getting with him. He's kind of like Ron Hainsey, honestly, for what Ron Hainsey was for the Leafs when he played here. But I just want to know, should the Oilers be making this trade?
The Oilers should only be making this trade if, like you said, there is a third team in the trade involved to act as the broker. That's the only situation I would make that trade if I were the Oilers GM, because, I mean, how many years does he have left on his contract? I think it's 2 or 3 at this point.
I believe so, yes.
After this year, yeah, something in that ballpark. If they just eat his salary just like that, that's like, I don't see the point in that, because like you said, you know what Duncan Keith is at this point. You know what you're getting with him. He's more of a third pairing guy than he was back when he signed the deal. And that just obviously it happens with guys that age, and you can't really get around that. But yeah, I mean, it's one of those things, like I said, where you'd have to get the third team in there to broker the deal and to take on some money, because otherwise I don't see where the value is there. I don't see why you wouldn't just explore free agency for more options on the defensive core. I mean, look at a guy maybe like Dougie Hamilton, or obviously he's right-handed, Duncan Keith's left-handed. But either way, I think there's definitely better options, younger options, and options that might cost less than Duncan Keith. So if they were to make that trade, they'd have to get another team to eat some salary, because otherwise I don't really see why that would make sense for them.
Well, it's just weird because the Oilers' clear need is to get some more secondary scoring. Like Oscar Klefbom is going to be inserted back into the lineup next year. I don't know what their plan is for Evan Bouchard, because they just never let that guy play a full season. It seems like he's always only playing a few bits and bits of games. They have a lot of options. I mean, Philip Broberg is even going to at some point have to challenge his way into the lineup. And now you're going to have Duncan Keith getting into his 40s almost, playing over him. That doesn't necessarily seem like the best decision. And I just wonder, do you see a player like Caleb Jones going back the other way? Because he's been rumored to be in a potential trade package.
Yeah, I mean, the Oilers, they have a couple of they got a couple of good-looking defensive prospects on the back end. They've got, I mean, Ethan Bear is not much of a prospect anymore, but he was one of their younger guys that they're looking to bring in, getting some ice time. They've got there's 2 guys that I always mix up. Is it Philip Broberg on the Oilers?
Yes.
Because there's one. Yes. Okay. Because there's another Swedish. It's Adam Boqvist. I always get Philip Broberg and Adam Boqvist mixed up.
Adam Boqvist is really
ironically
good.
enough, Boqvist. He is, and he's on the Blackhawks, ironically enough. So yeah, I'm glad I got that name right. But yeah, they've got Broberg on the back end. They've got Evan Bouchard, who they drafted a couple years ago as well. And I think they're at a point now where they can afford to shed some of these younger defensive prospects in trade. So if they were to make a trade for Keith, I could see Jones going back the other way, just because I think he's kind of like mellow enough of a prospect that you can get away with trading him for a guy like Keith, and you wouldn't necessarily get a lot of outcry. But again, I don't think it would be worth it if Keith's salary wasn't being eaten by another team. So
yeah, I would agree with you. I remember there's a lot of backlash with Drake Caggiula. Funny enough, was traded to Chicago. I could kind of see it being a similar position like that, because Caggiula has kind of been a tweener player at this point, but he did look good in Chicago. Caleb Jones is probably a third pairing guy at most, this looks like, in his career. And I think if you really do believe not Dougie Hamilton, I wish, but Duncan Keith provides the elements that they need. Obviously he's won 3 Stanley Cups. You can't really, deny that type of part of his game. But he was in the first percentile in WAR this past season. Like he's not even, and I mean, they are playing him as a first pairing defender in Chicago, which is kind of crazy looking at it. Maybe I think he would obviously play a lot better if he's in the third pairing role. Could maybe even be replacement level. You have to hope. But there's a lot of questions there. It makes sense if he really wants to go back. I know there's other reasoning there to kind of be back with his family. So maybe he'll play better in that position. Playing with Connor McDavid always helps. But the Oilers better not only be doing that this offseason is what I would say. They have to be doing more than that. Mm-hmm. And unlike what Ken Holland said previously, he needs to get creative.
Yes, he does. Very much so. Yeah, you don't want Duncan Keith to be your big ticket move of the offseason, especially if you're in a position like the Oilers where you just got swept.
Yeah, I agree with you there. And, a team that's already making a lot of moves here is the Nashville Predators, trading away Victor Arvidsson to the Los Angeles Kings for a 2021 second and 2022 third round picks. And Alex, a lot of people, including Philip Forsberg himself, did not like this trade for the Preds. I know Arvidsson really had a low shooting percentage last year. And his strong underlying numbers kind of indicate he will rebound next year. This is a player that scored 34 goals in the 2018-19 season. I just want to know, was this just like an expansion draft move, you think, for the Predators?
It would have had to be, because I don't understand any other reason to make that trade with LA besides to clear space for the expansion draft. I really, really like this trade for LA. I think it's a steal for them. And truth be told, assuming we go back to the regular divisions next year, I could see the Kings sneaking into the playoffs. Obviously they showed kind of they showed kind of like bursts of I don't know what the word is. Like they showed some hints that they might be on the cusp of contending for a playoff spot this past season, but I think ultimately Minnesota was just too good toward down the stretch for them. Kaprizov was kind of running away and carrying his team. But I think the Kings have one of the nicest prospect pools in the league. And if you're bringing in Quentin Byfield into a full-time role next year, which I assume they'll do, and then you've got Alex Turcotte as well, who's on the cusp of being ready for the NHL. And then you throw Victor Arvidsson into the mix. I really like the Kings team, and I like the way they're shaping up. And the fact that they were able to get Arvidsson, who's proven he can score 30 goals before, for a second and a third round pick, and the second round pick is in a draft as weak as the 2021 draft. I love this trade for LA. Don't love it for Nashville.
No, I agree with you there. And I was just going to talk about how on Twitter you mentioned the LA Kings being a sleeper team. You're forgetting even a prospect like Arthur Kaliev, who I know dropped in his draft year. A lot of people were low on him. He's already scored an NHL goal. Like I mean, he could easily be a contributor starting next season for that team. Trevor Moore, who they acquired from the Leafs, been a very effective player. Played at above a 30-point pace this upcoming season. Last season, I mean. Andrei Kopitar still playing quite effective hockey, even at his age. And I mean, don't forget, they were even somehow able to get rid of Jeff Carter's cap hit. This management is kind of making a lot of moves here where I'm like, wow, they're actually fixing this team very nice here. And I don't think they're really getting the respect they deserve. Even Drew Doughty's starting to play better, which they really needed them to after that down year. And even another player I want to mention, Tobias Bjornford, who was their the Leafs pick, actually, I believe. He was a full-time NHL defenseman last year. And they have a lot of those kind of like guys, like even like a Sean Walker, Matt Waugh. People don't talk enough about those players. And obviously I know in the market like LA, where you live in Toronto, you don't necessarily hear a lot about these players, but the Kings are going to be a playoff team, if not next year, even though I think they're going to be very much in until the end of the year. 2 years from now, you're going to start to see them be a playoff contender because they just have too much, especially if they try to go for Jack Eichel.
Oh God. Yeah. I am excited to see how that story unfolds this summer. And I know you are too, being a Sabres contributor for the hockey writers there. That'll be a fun off season for you.
Definitely. And I know, I mean, LA said they're out on the sweepstakes. Most people believe in the industry that that's pretty false. Like I would be pretty surprised that they're out. Maybe if they don't, I could see them not wanting to trade Quentin Byfield, but I think there could be a trade made there between those two teams, but I just want to touch back on it because I want to know what you think Nashville's looking like in the future here, because the Steve Dangle podcast even touched upon this, Steve and Adam. If I were them, I don't think I'm protecting either Ryan Johansson or Matt Duchene in the expansion draft just because of their cap hits. And I'm kind of just daring them to take one of them at this point.
Oh, I would be in that exact same position. I think Matt Duchene and Ryan Johansson, as much as they've tried to kind of squeeze out as much production from both of those guys as they can. I mean, those contracts are not looking that good for Nashville. And I think the fact that both of them have been kind of underwhelming, I think speaks volumes about the situation that Nashville's in salary wise right now. And it's a tough call to make. Who knows? Either of those guys could end up sort of being like the James Neal almost of this year's expansion draft, where maybe one of them sees a resurgence if they're playing for Seattle. But I don't know, like the based on the position they're in right now, if you can get Seattle to take one of those guys, and all of a sudden that's like 7-8 million freed up off the cap. So I don't know if I'd go as far to say that I want them to take one of those guys, but I'm kind of in the position where if I'm David Poile, yeah, go ahead. You can take one. It won't affect me either way if you do.
I don't know. I get the sense Predators would probably protect Duchene just because, he just signed there. He wanted to play there. I could see Johansson being the guy. He kind of seems like a player I think at this point they might be ready to move on from. And that would be very interesting because I think in Seattle, he could actually be a decent player there, especially because he'll be given those first line matchups. I know he is now, but sometimes that change of scenery is just all you need. And you have to wonder, playing in the market, just playing with the expansion team, there's some type of magic that happens, I guess, playing for an expansion team for some of these players that could work. And it's interesting because we just talked about Victor Arvidsson. They wanted to trade him for expansion draft reasons. Well, this is what their expansion would even look like. It's Philip Forsberg, obviously, you're protecting. Then you have guys like Colton Sissons, Kalle Järnkrok. These are the next guys that they would need to protect. So they're actually a team that could be in LA's position very soon. I think they could be acquiring forwards for maybe lower value at some point because I think they're ready to go into a rebuild here, I think, in Nashville. I think you're starting to see that. I think Matthias Ekholm's going to be at the door very shortly here, too. I think you're going to see a full-blown rebuild. And David Poile's just going to blow everything up. I don't know if you agree with that, but.
No, I definitely do. I think at this point, Nashville is sort of just clinging on to their defensive core. They've got one of the better defensive cores in the league. Obviously, Ekholm's a great defenseman. Obviously, Roman Josi, we all know how good he is. Ryan Ellis, like they've got good defensemen, but their offense really, like you said, it leaves a lot to be desired. And I do think that I think they've been on the cusp of rebuilding for a couple of years now. And obviously you can say what you want about them making the playoffs this year, but I don't know. I truthfully don't see Nashville really being a serious contender over the next couple of years. And I think it's probably be better for them to just rip the Band-Aid off and start the rebuild sooner rather than later if I was David Poile.
I know there is some promise there. I mean, Dante Fabro's an interesting enough player. I know there's kind of some scrutiny around him. Eli Tolvanen, though, really came in this year and finally proved he can actually be a decent player. Maybe not worth all the hype he got on his last KHL season, but I think that could be maybe even a 30-goal player at some point in the future. I think that's the type of player he could be.
Yeah.
And if they can finally get some draft picks and get some younger players that can play next to him and that can be the real play drivers of this team heading forward, I think you could see Nashville in a few years if they do this right. And I don't know if David Poile's that guy that's going to do it right. So we're going to have to see. Hopefully something happens here because Nashville's a great hockey market when they're on. We've seen that building go crazy, whether it was in the Stanley Cup Finals, even this past playoffs, they were going crazy. And you have to hope they can make it back soon.
100% agree.
And with that, we can head into our 3 NHL predictions. I'm going to hand you again some true or false questions here. Love doing this to end off the show. But the first one I got here. True or false? Montreal forces Game 6 in the Stanley Cup Finals. Do you say true or false? They force it or they don't?
False.
False.
I say false because I could see, like I said, I'm not ruling out Montreal challenging and coming
Sounds
back
like you are, though, Alex.
Game 7 or Game 6. Well, I'm not ruling it out, but if I were to make a set in stone prediction, even if the Habs were to come out and win in front of their home crowd, I have a very hard time seeing them winning Game 5 in Tampa Bay. So I'm saying false.
Yeah, I'm gonna pick the false there too. Honestly, I don't know. It seems like it could go to Game 5, but like with how crazy this playoffs have been, I'm kind of sensing even a sweep could happen here. So we'll have to see. I think, like I said, it could be one way or the other. But we can head into our second one here. Very interesting. Involves the team I covered, as we mentioned, the Buffalo Sabres. True or false? Jack Eichel is traded before the NHL draft.
I'm gonna go false on that one as well. I feel like if it like, unless we see a situation like a couple of years ago, you remember that day when the Subban and Weber trade happened and Steven Stamkos signed within like the same. I think there was another big trade that day as well.
It was Hall. I remember it was Hall for Larson, Subban for Weber, and then Stamkos signed. Yeah, all within like 13.
Yes,
I think that happened on June 29th, 2016. I think I remember that day. I remember that day very well, actually.
That was my most wild 15 minutes as a hockey fan.
Oh, it was mine too, man.
But no, no, unless a situation like that happens this year, I think we'd probably be hearing a little more chatter about Eichel and about where he could potentially end up. I mean, I know there's obviously the speculation, LA's out, Columbus is potentially in. I know New York Rangers. There's a whole bunch of speculation, but I don't think we're close enough. The draft is only in a couple weeks, so I don't think we're close enough at this point where we could see a trade happen before then. As for the rest of the offseason, I think maybe, but not before the draft. So I will say false again.
Well, during Don Granato's press conference when he was introduced to being the official coach of the team, it was talked about how the fact that Eichel's agent, Pete Fisher, said that they are reaching a resolution with the team. Now, that can be interpreted a lot of ways. Doesn't that maybe they could somehow repair this, or maybe they're reaching a resolution and that means a trade. So if they're nearing that, I have to wonder. I'm going to go true here. I think there is a chance he is going to get traded before the draft. I'll do it to be different. I could definitely see it happening afterwards. And I mean, I don't know what they're going to go for here. I don't know what's going to be the best decision. They need to get they can't lose that Jack Eichel trade. Although they most likely are. It's hard for me to say that I don't have confidence at all that they're going to win it. But I hope that we could look back on this trade somewhat similar to the Matt Duchene trade that the Colorado Avalanche can look back on now. I hope we could 80% look back on that trade like the Avs fans do that one, because that one changed the course of their franchise. And that'd be
interesting.
I want to have some hope that the Sabres can do something here, get a decent player back.
I don't blame you. I've been a Leafs fan for 16 years now. Hope is my main strong suit.
I know it's weird because even before I started covering the Sabres, I'm not a huge Sabres fan, but covering the team has kind of made me a lot more empathetic towards the fans, and I'm finding myself even growing as a Sabres fan. It's pretty crazy. This is like what the Leafs were like, but way worse. This is 10 times worse what's happening in Buffalo, and I don't think people truly understand it. And it doesn't necessarily seem like it's going to get better in the at least short term here, but you have to hope they can win that deal. Now, the last one, this is a Leaf-centric podcast. We got a true or false here, in that the Leafs keep Morgan Riley and sign him to a contract extension this offseason. True or false?
I don't want to go 3 for 3, but I think I have to. False. If anything, I think maybe we can see Morgan Riley playing out his last year in Toronto. I know there's obviously speculation that he'll get traded this offseason, but the way I see it, I think Rasmus Sandin being there puts a lot of pressure on the Leafs, and I think Morgan Riley is what he is at this point, and I don't know what he'll demand, because we've ever since he signed that contract when he was making $5 million a year, Riley put up a 72-point season, and he's shown that he's capable of doing that again. Obviously, the last couple of years have been a little bit mellow for him, but you don't lose that ability of your game. Like Freddie Anderson says, he knows he can be good. You can say the same thing about Morgan Riley. You know that there's untapped potential for him to get back to where he has been before. But I think Rasmus Sandin being there, based on the maturity level and the decision making and just the two-way game that Rasmus Sandin possesses at age 20 or 21 or whatever he is, this might be a little bit of a hot take in itself. I could see him developing into a top 2 defenseman.
No, I'm with you. I think Sandin could put up like 40 points next year. I talked to Peter Berrettini on my last episode. The reason I think that is if he's getting first line power play minutes, I think you're going to be surprised by how many points he puts up. Like I think maybe not necessarily 40, but I think he'll be a real surprising factor for this team.
Especially because you think back to how when he made his season debut, or sorry, not his season debut, when he made his NHL debut, that was on the team that had Morgan Rielly and Tyson Barrie. So he was not getting any power play opportunities. And even last year, I mean, I personally liked him on the power play better than I liked Rielly on the power play this year.
I did
and
too.
I think it's just a matter of getting him into that position. So I'm not sure that I don't know how they'll approach the situation. If Rielly were to sign an extension, same thing as Freddie, it would have to be at the same value, or maybe a little bit more than what he's making right now, or maybe a little bit less. It would have to be around that. I don't see the Leafs bringing him back long term, though. I think eventually he's got to pass the torch on Rasmus Sandin.
You know, I would like to say false here, and I know that sounds bad. I mean, I love Morgan Rielly was my favorite player for a long time, and I think he's still my favorite player, really, just because he was a player I really loved looking up to back in the early days of being a fan of this team, and to see his career evolve the way it has, it's been very awesome. And I think people do criticize him a bit too much. He had a good playoffs, especially as well. But with Rielly, I do think it's going to be true here, because Kyle Dubas hasn't given me any reason to kind of believe he's not going to commit to these players. And I agree with what you say here. It would be likely that he would play it up, but it has come out that they want to get this done this summer. You know, if Rielly's getting extended, They want it done this summer. And if it doesn't happen, I think you're going to see a trade. And I just don't know. The problem is I don't know how much you should be committing to him, right? Like, I don't know if I want to be paying Morgan Rielly more than William Nylander at 7 to 7.5. And
no, exactly.
I remember talking to Josh Kim about that. Josh Kim of the Hockey Writers as well. I had him on the show, and he was like, "What? 7.5?" And I'm like, "Yeah, this guy had a 70-point season. That's what he's going to be asking for." And I would be very shocked if he signed for less than that, especially if he's on the open market. I would
too. And well, at that, and then like I said, the Rasmus Sandin factor. It's not like Morgan Rielly is the Leafs' only hope for an offensive puck moving defenseman on the left side. Rasmus Sandin is right there, and he's proven that he's ready for a full-time NHL role. And soon, being ready for a full-time NHL role is going to turn into being ready for top 4 minutes, and potentially even being ready for top 2 minutes. So Rasmus Sandin's sitting there waiting to show the Leafs what he's capable of, and I think that puts a lot of pressure on Morgan Rielly, either to not put pressure on Morgan Rielly, I should say, but it puts pressure on Kyle Dubas to make a decision regarding what to do with Morgan Rielly.
Definitely. And I mean, we saw it with guys like JVR Bozak. They all played it out and left. We've likely seen it this year with Zach Hyman. You know, they even traded for Nick Foligno. And although I think it is a possibility he comes back on a 1-year extension, I think the signs kind of point to at this point he's probably going back to Columbus, unless they do it after the expansion draft, maybe. So I guess that would be likely at that point. But I don't know. Kyle Dubas' track record kind of suggests that you would think Rielly. I think Rielly's too good of a player that you're not going to see him play it out, because that's kind of a very huge risk if he does go to free agency, because I don't think you can do that with your number one defenseman. That'd be pretty irresponsible in my opinion.
No, for sure. And
there's guys out there, not that I want Seth Jones, but even Dougie Hamilton, players out there that you could replace him with. So like I said, very fascinating. Exactly. I have no idea what's going to happen. I'm saying true, but I really don't know what the Leafs are going to do this offseason regarding that. But
I'm saying the exact same thing for my false answer. I'm saying false, but I have no idea. So
I definitely agree with you there. And with that, I think we're ready to end off the show. So I just want to say thanks for listening to the Babbling Buds podcast. Make sure to follow Alex on Twitter. His username is @HobsonA16, and check out his work as he preps for the 2021 NHL draft. Do you have anything you want to promote that's coming out soon, Alex?
Not really. No, I mean, well, actually, I will take a second to promote the incredible work that Matthew Zador and
he's doing a lot.
Right. I think it might be Zador or Zador. I'm not 100%, but he's been doing some incredible work as the head of the draft content for the Hockey Writers this year. We're pumping out so many draft profiles right now. We've actually got a new series going on at the Hockey Writers called the Road to the Draft series, where we're taking a look at each first round selection in the first round over the past 10 years. So like one day we'll do we started off with the 32nd overall pick, and we take a look at the last 10 32nd overall picks, and then we include a little snippet of players that could go 32nd overall this year, and then an all-time list of every player to ever go at that stage.
I know, it's very cool.
That's a really interesting series. We're down to I think we're up to 25th overall at this point. And the Hockey Writers draft team, I mean, they love the draft. They live and breathe the draft. So if you're looking to educate yourself on the players to look for this year, it's a bit of a weird year with not really a surefire first overall pick, and the fact that the CHL barely got a season. It's a very interesting year for the draft. So I would definitely check out the Hockey Writers draft guide, because they've all got you covered. They know their stuff, and they'll make your viewing experience when the time comes much easier. So
yeah, I agree with you there. I mean, even I'm trying my best to get involved in some ways. I got a prospect profile on Arvid Sandin. I don't know if you've know much about him as a prospect, but he is the player. By the time this is out, you're probably already going to be able to read that, so you can check that out on the Hockey Writers as well. And I just want to say once again, thanks for listening or watching on whatever platform you're on. And we have babbled enough for today. Until next time.